Good afternoon. Yes, always a few of us today. Remember, next Sunday morning will be our adult Christmas choir bringing a great time of worship. Think about a friend this week that you can invite, especially someone who's lost, someone who's unchurched, so they can come and hear the gospel story and the song. It'll be a good time of worship. And then the following Sunday evening will be our children's musical, and that is always a wonderful time, a fun time of worship, but also a serious time of worship. And I know you look forward to and want to bring a friend to that as well. Plus we'll have a time of food and fellowship afterward. Is that right, Barbara? Oh, sign-up sheet, okay. We'll have food and fellowship if you sign up and bring something. All right. It could just be fellowship. It'll be good. All right. For several years now, we have looked at different groups. Some of them rather strange, like Scientology. Others, just different traditions or denominations of Christianity. Others that have interest for historical purposes. All of them help us to define who we are as a people, as Baptists, and help us understand our particular theology, our particular understanding of Scripture, and our understanding of Scripture generally. We started last Sunday night looking at a group that in many ways is a lot like Baptists, especially in their beginnings. There are some significant differences, however, and we'll begin to notice that even tonight. But we have a lot of things in common as well. The Methodists, and what is now called the United Methodist Church in the United States. They, like a lot of other movements, have fractured along the way, and so there are different versions, different groups. But the main group is the United Methodist Church. And the Methodists pretty much would agree, I think, that they draw their roots from a man named John Wesley. Really, there was a triumvirate, John and his brother Charles, and another fellow named George Whitefield. But John was the organizer. He was the brains behind the group. He was the writer. He was the one who preached thousands of sermons, published hundreds of books, and worked for a lifetime where he lived into his 80s, organizing a group that outlived him after he was finished. Now, John's driving concern in his life seemed to be a desire to have a sense of assurance of his own salvation. That seemed very important to him, and so that colored a lot of what he did, and it helps us understand his movement, his group, and his life. And so we're using 1 John chapter 3, verses 21 through 24 as our text from the Bible for this part of our series. If you would like to open your New Testament or read through those verses, think as we do about that question. How can you have assurance of your salvation? How can you know that you are an authentic, biblical Christian? How do we know that we're right with God? How can we know that when we die and we face God, that we will go to heaven and not hell, that we will be right with Him and not be punished? And so think about those questions as we read these. This is the elder John writing to the church, and he says, "Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we have confidence before God." That first verse states the issue, really. This is what John Wesley was looking for, was confidence before God. And John the elder, the apostle in the first century at the end says, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we can have confidence before God. Well, what does it take? He goes on and gives us another result. He says, "And whatever we ask, we receive from Him, because we keep His commandments, and the things that are pleasing before Him we do." So He gives us a couple of things there. We keep His commandments, and the things that are pleasing to Him we do. Not just keeping commandments. You know, a lot of people may think that the Bible is just about commandments, or that religion is just about commandments, but commandments are sort of the the negative side in a lot of ways, the bottom. We want to go beyond the commandments. That's a starting point. But in the New Testament, when it talks about love, love doesn't need a commandment necessarily. A commandment may help love, but love inspires us to do things that go beyond the commandments. And so he says here, not just keep his commandments, but notice in verse 22, that do the things that are pleasing to him. To do the things that are pleasing to him. Not just to obey him, but to please him. Beyond obedience, if you will. Verse 23, and this is his command. So by now, the one who's reading this is thinking, aha, this is what I've been asking. This is what I want to know. What is the command that I have to keep to please God? And here he says it in verse 23, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, or that we trust in the name. Here's that word, pistuo, which is so prevalent and important in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it's the crux of the issue for us, to not just to believe intellectually, but to trust, to place our faith in the name of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And name in the Bible simply means the person, the individual. But there's more to it than that. Notice there's an and that we love one another. The essence of what the Bible teaches is to obey God and to love one another. Everything else is details, and there are a lot of them, but that's the heart and soul in many, many places. John, when he was a young man, heard Jesus teach this himself when he was asked, what is the greatest command? Jesus said, well, you can't boil it down to one command. There has to be two. The greatest two commands are these: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so John's reflecting that here in the answer that he gives, to trust in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and to love one another, just as he commanded us to do at the end of verse 23. And then 24, he says, the one who keeps his command, in him he remains, and he remains in him. The pronouns are a little confusing there, but he's saying that we have a relationship with God, whereby the Spirit of God actually is in our life. And so we're connected. And this is one of the things that John Wesley was concerned about. Perhaps there's somebody here tonight who's asked the same question. How do I know that God's Holy Spirit is in my life? How can I tell that God has literally taken up residence in my life, just like I read about in the Bible and I hear people talk about, teach about, and preach about? You get a lot of different answers to that. John was working on his answer, John Wesley, which we'll look at. Some people say if you speak in tongues, you can know that you have the Holy Spirit in your life. Some people might say, well, if you just love one another, you have the Holy Spirit in your life. Some people would say, well, if you're concerned for the downtrodden and the ones who need to be liberated, then that's the sign that God's Spirit is in your heart. And John he had read the Bible, he knew the Bible, so he wasn't coming at this question as somebody who was not informed. He was informed. In fact, John was a trained theologian. He was a priest in the Anglican Church. And so he had been through the Bible, and he had learned the Bible. There's spin on it, of course, but he had read Scripture, and he knew what it said. So the one keeping his commands, in him he remains, and he remains in him. And by this you know that he remains in you, from the Holy Spirit which he has given us. So he's really said three things here. He said that we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, that we love one another, and that we have this inner witness of God's Holy Spirit, that we belong to him. We read about that in other places in the New Testament as well. Romans chapter 8, we have an inner witness that God's Spirit is in our life. If I were to ask you tonight if you've ever had an experience where you knew that God was working in your life, I can remember the first time that it happened to me, and it was a little unsettling because I had never experienced it before, and it was a rebuke, actually. My first experience of knowing that God's Spirit was in my life was when God rebuked me. That's kind of a bad start, but at least later I reflected on it and said, well, it was a bad start, but at least I know God's Spirit's in my life, so that's a good thing. Hallelujah, that was good. But we want to make sure that we have that witness in our heart that God's Spirit is there. So, back to John. Number one on your outline, we've already filled these first three sentences out. Just a quick review. The Methodist Church traces its roots to John and Charles Wesley, their brothers. John and Charles Wesley, who lived in 18th century England. They were living at the time our country was being born. John was born in 1703 and died in about 1791, I believe it was, within his later 80s. And so he literally lived through the period of time when we were breaking away from England and writing the Constitution. And George Washington was being elected as our first president. And John says some interesting things about these historical facts too. But that's the period of time. Now, where he lived in England, they had just restored the monarchy, and there was a very weak moral climate. It was very dry spiritually. The Anglican Church had sort of dried out, the established church, but there was this movement, it started in Germany and had moved across into England called Pietism, where people were trying to rediscover a personal relationship with God. And they could see that they weren't getting it in church, and so they began to form their own groups. They weren't trying to start a new church. They were just looking for God. They weren't as concerned about the church as they were about their relationship with God. And so they began to form these societies and gather together for prayer and for Bible study and to live holy lives. And so this is the environment that John and Charles were born into. Number two, while studying to be an Anglican priest, John Wesley began a pursuit of holiness characterized by rules and self-examination. I mentioned last week that this is not unlike Luther, who went through the same stage where he thought that he could find assurance by keeping the rules. Maybe you've been through that. Maybe you're going through that right now. You think to yourself, if I just do what's right and avoid doing what's wrong, then I know that I'll be right with God. The problem is that that very easily falls into a what kind of righteousness? Paul calls it righteousness by what? By works. And so this is one of the problems that we fall into very easily is when we try to gain our righteousness before God by our own works. Paul says we're in a dangerous place because we have turned our back on grace. John knew about grace. John was struggling with something that maybe you are tonight. What's the relationship between works and grace? Because surely the Bible tells us that there are certain things that we're expected to do. So how do we do those things without thinking of them as being our righteousness? How do we do what's right and think that know that our righteousness is through faith in Christ? And this is something that John Wesley was grappling with. His father was an Anglican priest. His mom, Susanna, we talked about her last week, very pietistic and an unusual woman. And a lot of what John and Charles were able to accomplish, she gets credit for from a lot of people. She was a unique lady. So he started at Oxford when he was studying a holy club. Can you imagine going onto a campus nowadays, in the list of clubs there you see a holy club. That's not a word that people think of in positive terms. And really, it wasn't then either. People made fun of John and his group. They thought he was a little crazy, especially for getting up early in the morning and fasting and doing all of these things. And he would write diaries where he kept up with everything he did every hour of the day and rated himself on how devout he was and his love for God. He just really, to a lot of people, he was way over the line, but he was searching for this sense of assurance. Number three, Wesley faced death in a storm while sailing to Georgia and realized that his faith was weak. After he graduated, he took assignment in Georgia, and he came over here to do two things. One, to evangelize the Indians in that area, and two, to be a chaplain, so to speak, for the white settlers in that area. He didn't do very good with the Indians. He did okay with the white settlers, but eventually that didn't work out too good either. He was only there for a couple of years, and then he was back to England, and that was the end of his missionary journey to the New World. But something interesting happened to him on the way over. There were 3 storms, and in the storms, he was terrified to die. And it scared him to death because he thought, well, why should I be terrified to die if I know that I'm right with God, if I have assurance of my salvation? And there were some Moravians on board, some German Christians, and they weren't bothered by the storm at all. They were ready to die. And he was stunned by that, and he wanted to find out more about how they could have such assurance of their faith. And so when he got back to London, he began to study what it was they knew. It was a very low point. A guy told him, John, you don't have weak faith, you have no faith. You're lost. And he believed him, and he was stunned. He didn't know what to do. And then he went to a meeting at Aldersgate one night, and they were reading Luther's preface to his commentary on the book of Romans, of all things, the book in the Bible that tells us how to be justified. And John says he felt his heart strangely warm within him, and he knew that his faith was in Jesus. Not his words, mine, but words similar to that. And so a lot of people point that to that experience as John's evangelical conversion. Whether or not it was, we don't know, because he was immediately back down in the doldrums again. Because of his understanding of the Bible told him, now I will see all the fruits of the Spirit in my life. That's what he'd been looking for, is the fruit of the Spirit. Until he could get that, he didn't think he was saved. And he thought, now that I've had this stirring in my heart, I've had this experience with the Holy Spirit, now I will see the fruits of the Spirit. And there was one fruit that he didn't see. He didn't have joy. And he thought, oh no, I'm still not saved. I don't have joy. I've got love and I've got peace, but I don't have joy, so I'm not saved. And so he was still going back to his lists and his, he wouldn't call it this, but it looks like sort of a works righteousness. But here's number 4 on your outline. Let's fill it in and we'll keep moving forward. This is where we stopped last week. Wesley finally experienced a sense of assurance about salvation when his heart was strangely warmed in a society meeting. When his heart was strangely warmed in a society meeting. Now he very quickly lost that sense and began to struggle again, but for a moment things seemed to be good. One thing to try to understand Wesley, we need to understand the intensity of the evangelical revival that was taking place both in England and in the United States in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, something far beyond any of us have experienced in our lifetime. The evangelical revival in the first half of the 18th century was one of the most influential movements in the modern period. It made a huge difference. Now, for those of you who have been to college, especially in a secular school, and worked on advanced degrees, and you've worked in history, it might sound stunning for you to hear me say that. Because I don't know to what degree our current textbooks in a lot of schools even address the evangelical revival. Ended up calling it the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening in the 1700s and the early 1800s. And the importance of those two movements, or of those two parts of one movement, to what our country is today, even to this very day. And if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to go and do some reading on it, especially if you love history. And if you want to understand our country, you cannot understand, listen carefully what I'm about to say, because this is absolutely true. You cannot understand the United States of America without understanding what was happening in Christianity in the 1700s and the 1800s. And I would say the same thing is true in the 1900s and even now. You can't understand our country without understanding our Christian roots. But when you look at those two, the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, it becomes clearly evident that a lot that was happening morally, ethically, and that's what's driving the laws that are being written, was all in the environment of this incredible, what ended up being called an awakening, a spiritual awakening. And it happened in the environment of a very dark period. In England, it was called the Wesleyan Revival. Here, it was called the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was one of the preachers here, and George Whitefield went back and forth between England and America. Charles and John were in England. But there had become a strong rationalism. People were beginning to question the validity of the Bible. Is it true? Do we need it? Do we even need special revelation? Why can't we just explore nature for ourselves and arrive at truth apart from some word from God that they would say we're not even sure if he exists? So rationalism was beginning to take over, and the churches grew very cold, and people were not getting anything out of these established churches. And in England, deism began to take hold, which was a movement that said, you know, whether or not God exists doesn't really matter. what matters is that we don't need a revelation from God. We can explore the world and understand what's going on our own. And all religions are basically the same anyway, as long as they're rational. They're really just an expression of human need for God and virtue. Now that's continued to play itself out over the last couple, 300 years. And it's a fascinating discussion on its own, which we'll have another time. But right now, we just need to recognize that this is the environment that John and Charles and George grew up in. It was an environment where there was a low state of morals, there was an indifference to religion, there was social unrest, there was economic upheaval too because of the Industrial Revolution that was taking place. People were being moved around, wealth was being concentrated in just a few hands. There was poverty was spreading out throughout England, and people were moving into cities. It's a very turbulent and difficult time to live, and people needed some kind of spiritual answers, and they weren't getting it from the traditional sources. And so they began to meet together in these societies, and they focused on a personal experience with God. Now, as these little groups started meeting in people's homes to pray and to read the Bible and to hold each other accountable, John began to be a leader in these groups and began to build connection between groups who were in agreement with one another. And in fact, the Methodists were called the Methodist Connection. And John talks over and over again in his writings about the connection. He often spells it with an X, but it's the same word, connection. And these groups who agreed with him and what he was teaching would become part of the Methodist Connection. The Methodist word being pejorative originally because they thought that these guys had come up with a new method and they poo-pooed it, but John just adopted the word after a while. You know, at some point you just use what you're given and you run with it. Now, here's what John did is he would choose preachers. Remember this revival going on. Nobody had ever seen somebody preach outdoors the way they did back then. These preachers would come into a town, and John would do it, George would do it, and they would preach outdoors, and literally thousands of people, thousands in towns with much smaller populations than what we're used to in the United States or in the 21st century, people would come from all over. It's almost like when Jesus went out into the wilderness and fed the 5,000. 5,000 men, we don't know how many people that was in total. And the same kind of thing was happening in rural England. It was also happening here in Kentucky and other places. These preachers would go out and they would begin to preach, and thousands of people would gather together. And so these itinerant preachers began to move around all over England in the United States and preach at different places. And John began to pick them up and put them in his connection. And he would form a group of places, meeting houses, and itinerant preachers, and he would put together a conference that would meet together, and he created the leadership for all of this. And there were circuits, and these itinerant preachers would go around these circuits. Eventually it spread out into Scotland, into Ireland, and eventually John sent some preachers to the United States, and that became the Methodist Church in the United States, which we'll talk about later. But John was like a lot of leaders and a lot of very organized people. He wanted to be in control of everything that was going on. So he picked the preachers that were acceptable to be in the houses that he put together. But this spread rather rapidly, and he continued to write the rules and to keep up with everything that was going on. One other thing that was different about John and Charles and this George Whitefield is that John and Charles were Arminian in their theology, and Whitefield was, what's the opposite of that? Anybody know? Calvinist. We'll come back to that, but that's an important point. There were some undercurrents theologically that were going to cause some division. The results of the evangelical movement were, as I've said, phenomenal. It actually did revitalize the Anglican Church, at least for a while. There was a whole generation of more evangelical priests and leaders in the church. One of them, you might recognize his name, and John actually has some correspondence with this man. Does anybody recognize the name William Wilberforce? Who was William Wilberforce? What was his passion? Slavery. Spent his life because of his Christian convictions that slavery was evil. He spent his life erasing slavery in Great Britain. A lot of other societies came into existence. Missionary societies, Bible societies, tract societies. John's movement, rightly so, was very concerned about the needs of people in poverty, the needs of people who were uneducated, and so he was engaged in community ministries, what we would call today community ministries, also, just like we are, through the Ruby Snyder Center and other places. He had a concern for those who were in need. But the important thing to remember here is that this movement emphasized a personal experience that validated spirituality or religion in a world where religion was being invalidated through skepticism. And a lot of groups got renewed, including Baptists in England and in the United States. So Wesley's personal search for assurance of his salvation went on through this pursuit of holiness. But I'm going to say to you tonight that his Anglican background caused part of the confusion. His Anglican background caused part of the confusion that he had in his search for assurance. Now, I admit that I may be biased in saying that, but that's okay. Why do I say that? Does anybody know? What was it about Anglicanism in the established church that a Baptist would say would cause confusion about Wesley's search for assurance?
Infant baptism.
Thank you. Who said that? You get the theological gold star tonight. Infant baptism. So the Anglican Church, just like the Roman Catholic Church and many others, to make sure that everybody is a member of the church, baptize every baby just as soon as he or she is born. Right? Why would that cause confusion for someone later in life about their assurance of salvation? Come on, Baptists, I'm not going to let you leave here tonight until you know the answer to this question, because you're Baptists, I hope. And I'm in trouble.
They wonder why they have to get baptized again, or they think they've already been saved.
Well, they wondered why those crazy Anabaptists were out there, for one thing. Because this nutty group was out there telling everybody, you're not saved until you put your faith in Jesus, and you're supposed to get baptized after you put your faith in Jesus. And they thought they were nutcases. But for John, who did everything the way he was told, the way his parents told him to do it, and he believed in what they told him, he believed in the Anglican Church, he never wanted to start a new church. All through his life, he was loyal to the Anglican Church, and he tried desperately to keep the Methodists loyal to the Anglican Church. And so he adopted their teaching on infant baptism, and he defended it. He defended it, he believed it, he wrote about it. Why would that cause confusion about his salvation?
Because he doesn't personally believe in
Because he doesn't personally believe?
that. Yeah. If he believes that you're supposed to be baptized after you're saved, why would infants need to be baptized?
Why would infants need to be baptized? Now, he would answer that question the way a lot of established churches do, and say that New Testament baptism is equivalent to Old Testament circumcision. That baptism took the place of circumcision. Now, that's an interesting discussion. We've had it in here before, so I won't have it tonight. But we can do it again, or you can look it up and listen to it if you need to. My point tonight, though, is that it caused confusion for John. What if you grew up, maybe some of you did, in a home where as you got old enough, as you were taught the Bible, your parents just began to tell you, well, you're already saved. You were saved when you were a baby. And then you run into some friends at school, those crazy Baptists again. Or even crazier, those Assembly of God people. I'm just playing. And they say, no, you've got to put your faith in Jesus Christ. Each individual person has to decide to put their faith in Jesus. And then after you do that, you get baptized as a sign and a testimony that you've asked Jesus to be your Savior. But you've been taught all your life by your parents and at church and your Sunday school teachers and the people in your church, you've been taught, no, you were already saved. What would happen? see how a person would be confused? You would know what you are? A man or a woman, I hope. But there we go. I like the way David Chris thinks, You would be confused, I think. You'd have to work through it. Maybe that's part of what John is trying to work through, is try to figure out how he could know experientially that he was right with God, rather than just taking the testimony of his parents. How did he know that he had God's Spirit in his life? How did he know that he personally had put faith in Jesus Christ? Now, there's the beauty of having a conversion experience, right? If you're old enough to have a conversion experience where you, of your own free will, hear the gospel, understand the gospel, and respond positively to the gospel, then you can, for the rest of your life, remember that. Even if it doesn't happen just at one point. Some people's testimony is that it happens sort of over a period of time, but they can still say that at some period of time in their life, they reached a point where they received Jesus as Lord and Savior. A lot of people can say, well, I did it on this particular day. Some people could even tell you what time of day. I'm not sure that's absolutely necessary, but people who are converted can usually tell you at this stage in my life, at this time, I responded. And so when they begin to wonder about their salvation, they can think about what? They can think about their conversion experience. They can think about their baptism. They may still question it, but there's something to grab hold of that they were involved in, rather than something that happened when they weren't even there and didn't even understand it. So perhaps this is part of the reason that John was a little confused, even after having his heart strangely warmed. He still continued to struggle with all of this. And he continued to teach this. Listen to this. He continued to teach that the genuine Christian is the perfect Christian. In this period of his life, he said that a Methodist is a genuine Christian, and a genuine Christian is a perfect Christian. One who has the love of God shed abroad in his heart by the Holy Spirit. Complete sanctification. Entire sanctification. Now, what kind of problem is that going to solve? Or what kind of problem is that going to create?
Nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect, and so what's going to happen when I wake up tomorrow and before noon I've sinned? I must not be saved. If I couldn't make it to noon without sinning, then I must not be saved, and something's not working right. And then it sounds exactly like what John was going through. Remember, he is writing down in his diary what he does every hour and grading himself on his devotion. Now, if I did that, oh my goodness, it would be horrible. And if I thought that I had to be completely, totally sanctified and reach a state of perfection before I was saved, then I too would be wandering around wringing my hand. What's really stunning in some ways about John, more than anything else, is that he continued to preach and teach to others while he was going through this. And in fact, when he first came back from Georgia and he met a man named Bone who told him, no, John, it's not that your faith is weak, it's your faith is non-existent. John said, well, then I better stop preaching. I told you this last week, and this individual said, no, don't stop preaching. Just keep preaching grace until you have it. And then after you have it, preach on. I'm not sure that was good advice. So just more confusion in this man's life. Number 5 on your outline. Wesley's movement was fueled by his personal search for spiritual assurance and in the context of an evangelical revival. Evangelical revival. Now, his understanding of spirituality was reflected in his meeting houses. To join a society, a person had to demonstrate that they had a desire to flee from the wrath to come and be saved from their sins, but to continue in a society, they had to do 3 things. First, do no harm. Second, do good. And third, attending upon all the ordinances of God. Whoa. And John examined these people regularly. He and Charles. And after a while, there had to be others because there were so many members. But he examined the members of the meeting houses on a regular basis personally. And you had to make it through this examination to get a ticket, literally, that would allow you to come into the meeting house after that. Can you imagine having to have a ticket to come to Grace Baptist Church? That's exactly what they were doing. They had to have a ticket, and the ticket was issued by John or one of his leaders, and it was only issued after they were examined by the leader and found to be in a spiritual state that was acceptable to them. It's stunning that he would be doing that when he himself was struggling with his own standing before God. He's issuing tickets to other people to come in. John and Charles both examined them. Some of the Methodists were pretty open with the Wesleys about their inability to keep all these various rules. Thomas Willis wrote a letter to John in November of 1744. He explained his problem to John. He admitted to Wesley that he couldn't follow all that Wesley was asking. He was kind of an interesting guy. He had a nice theological bent in the way that he addressed Wesley. He said this. He said, I can follow the Savior's golden rule very near to perfection, he says, very near to perfection. But he told Wesley, I cannot follow all of your rules in the strictest sense. He went on to explain his problems. He said that their prohibition against buying and selling on the Lord's Day was a problem for him because he was in the milk trade. And he told John, he said, cows must be milked. Children must be fed. The milk will not last from Sunday to Monday. That's what he told John. And John's reply was, quite right. I don't know what that meant. I guess he gave the guy dispensation to deal with his milk on Sunday. But it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that was going on in these meeting houses. Another example gives you an idea of the kind of power that John wanted to have over these meeting places. There was a particular meeting place in Burstall where the group there owned the property. And John very quickly realized as these meeting houses were built that he needed to own them, the deed on the property. Because if he owned the deed on the property, then he could enforce the rules of who was going to preach there. He could choose the itinerant preacher that would go and preach in these particular meeting houses. If he didn't own the deed on the property, then the people there could say, we're not too happy with your preachers. We like this other guy over here. We're going to have him come in and preach. And John would begin to lose control. And that's exactly what happened here at Burstall. And so John figured out a way to deal with that. He told the meeting house at Burstall, apparently did this more than one time, he said, if you continue to have preachers that I don't send out preach in your meeting house, then I will take money from all of my other meeting houses and I will build a meeting house right next door to yours that looks so much better and is in such better shape that everyone from your meeting house will come to my meeting house. And I'll put you out of business. Sounds like he picked up a few things from some businessmen along the way. So John, as he grew older especially, really wanted to have a lot of control over what was going on in his movement. John married when he was 48 years old. He was married for 15 years. There's not a whole lot written about his marriage. He married a woman who was called Molly, who was described as a well-to-do widow and a mother of 4 children. They didn't have any children, and Molly left him after 15 years. One man writes that by 1758, she had left him, unable to cope, it is said, with the competition for his time and devotion presented by the ever-burgeoning Methodist movement. She went and came back, and finally she left him, and here's what John wrote after she was gone. I did not forsake her. I did not dismiss her. I will not recall her. Ouch. Ouch. So that just gives you an idea of how immersed this man was in his movement. Totally. Nothing else matters. It's not easy to start a movement. Number 6 on your outline. Wesley spent his life developing the rules and organization for itinerant preachers and meeting houses, which became the Methodist Church. Itinerant preachers and meeting houses, which became the Methodist Church. That itinerancy has still survived even to today somewhat in the moving around of Methodist preachers, but we'll talk more about that later. One more thing that I want to tell you about John before we move on to American Methodism in next Sunday night. As I mentioned to you earlier, John and George Whitefield, they didn't get along because George was a Calvinist and John was an Arminian. And that's a long, complicated subject. Listen, we'll keep it simple tonight. There's one thing that John believed that George didn't, and it caused them to have a hard time in the way that they taught and preached. And it had to do with whether or not somebody could be lost after they had been saved. And I believe this is part of John's confusion, and I accept the fact that a lot of denominations still today teach that a person can lose their salvation. John had a hard time with the Calvinism of his day because of the rigid teaching about predestination. A lot of Calvinists in his day taught that God, in time past, in eternity, chose who would be saved and who would be lost, and there really wasn't anything that anybody could do about that. You just sort of, as you lived your life, you just sort of discovered who was going to be saved and who was going to be lost, and there really wasn't much that you could do about that. If you were chosen to be saved, so be it. It didn't matter whether you lived a holy life or a righteous life or not, you were saved, it was okay. If you were chosen to go to hell, it didn't matter whether you lived a holy life or a righteous life. There was nothing you could do about that. As you can imagine, that bothered a lot of people. And they looked in the Bible and wondered if that's really what the Bible taught. And again, we've gone through this teaching in here before. If that's something that's interesting to you, you can look up the teaching that we did on John Calvin and what ended up being Calvinism. But what bothered John about that is that people would walk around and say, oh yeah, I'm going to heaven, I'm one of the elect, and live just an atrocious, horrible, immoral life. And John looked at his Bible and he said, I don't see that in the Bible. I don't know, that's not right at all. And so he didn't like Calvinism, at least the flavor that he ran into in England in the 1700s, because it led to what theologians call antinomianism. Nomos is the word for law, it means against the law, or against keeping the law, or against obeying God's laws. Now, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I wonder if there's anybody here tonight who thinks that somewhere along the way you've been taught that because you're saved, that you no longer have to obey God. Because I'm saved, I no longer have to obey God. Well, if you think that, I would love to disabuse you of that notion. That's certainly not what the Bible teaches, and that's one example of how Calvin's teachings, maybe not the man himself, although there are questions, but certainly his teachings after he was gone got formed into a rigid idea of theology that had some problems with it. But that was one thing that bothered John about Calvinism. And the other thing that bothered John about Calvinism is that just this whole idea of once saved, always saved. Now, you realize that those words are not in the Bible, but I would say that the idea is in the Bible. No one can snatch them from my hand, Jesus says, and so forth. And this is an argument back and forth between different groups. And I don't mind telling you where I come down on it. I believe in the perseverance of the saints. I believe that those who are truly saved will remain saved. I don't think that a person who's actually given their life to Christ can lose their salvation. And this caused a problem with John and his contemporaries because a lot of them believed that, but John didn't. John believed, as you can well imagine because of his approach to theology, he believed that if you didn't maintain your righteousness, that you would lose your salvation. You have to get saved and start all over again. And in many ways, that's probably what he thought was happening in his own life. And so that's one of the reasons that he taught a pursuit of Christian perfection, a pursuit of entire sanctification. And he was so convinced that he even published a magazine starting in 1777 called the Arminian Magazine, knowing that it would make all the Calvinists mad. And he pressed the issue of his Arminianism. But there's one thing that did happen to John before he died. He finally reached a point to where he realized that maybe this, quote, lower order of Christians did exist. He finally developed a theology of the servant and the son. He accepted the notion that some people, out of fear of God, have come to Christ in saving faith and become servants, but they haven't learned how to love God yet. Those who do become a son or daughter, a child of God. And that's the upper path. So there's the lower path and the upper path. And that's where he stopped in his inner deliberation and his understanding of how all of this works. Sanctification. Now let me ask you a question. The quest of a true believer is to become what? More like Christ? Like God? Anybody else? That's the right answer. Before we have Christ in our life, we cannot be like Christ. Once we have Christ in our life, it's incumbent upon us to become more and more like Christ. If we don't do a very good job of that, what does the Bible call us? Does the Bible distinguish between the servant and the son? Let's start out with that. Well, the Bible calls all of us saints. Don't you love that? And the world may think that's strange, but what that simply means is that we have the righteousness of Christ, not a righteousness of our own, but we have the holiness of God that's been given to us by faith because of Christ's sacrifice. Is it possible to be a Christian and not be a son or a daughter? I got one of these. Is it possible to be a Christian and not be a son or a daughter, a child of God? Okay, you're going to learn something tonight. Either you know it, you just don't want to answer me, or you're not sure. If you're not sure, here's the answer. No, it's not. That's where John, I think, got a little off track. He wasn't using biblical language. Here's the biblical language. The biblical language is that when we're saved, we're a son or a daughter of God. We're in the family. You're either in the family or out of the family. John seems to come up with this idea of, here's the house, and if you're in the family, you're inside, but you could be working in the front yard, maybe, and you haven't made it inside yet. You're a servant. Is that biblical? No. The prodigal son, when he came home, that's exactly what he wanted to do, because he didn't think that he could ever be a son again based on what he had done. And so he comes and he asks the father, or he was going to, ask the father just to be a servant again, and the father said, what? Can't do it. You are a son. It's the ring on the finger, the robe, the sandals, throws the party. And so it's impossible to be anything less than a son or a daughter if you're in Christ.
But Paul says on bondservants of Jesus Christ, so to me they're the same.
They are, in that sense. Now, Jamie brings up a good point. She uses Paul's example of calling himself a bondservant or slave of Jesus Christ. But that's not what John Wesley was talking about. He was talking about a servant in another sense. But that's a good point. John was trying to figure out these different levels of Christianity. And the Bible's only indication of those is language about food. Food. What am I talking about? Milk and meat. That's exactly right. Milk and meat. And so it is possible to be an immature Christian, a baby Christian, a teenage Christian, whatever, and only be able to drink milk. Or to be a mature Christian, more Christ-like, that's what we're shooting for, and be able to eat meat. By the way, what do you think he means by that? And that shows up both in Paul's writings and in the book of Hebrews. Some of you would say Paul wrote Hebrews, that's fine, I can go with that. It's there in more than one place. What does he mean by that, milk and meat? What's the difference between the Christian that can only take milk and the one that can only take meat? Don't know the Word of God. I'll take that. What else? Okay, but what is that maturity, Lisa? What specifically is he talking about?
He can grow in a relationship with God.
Okay, grow in a relationship with God, know God better, and that's going to lead to something, which is what I'm looking for. Strengthen your faith, which is going to lead to growing in God.
God uses us to
Okay.
do His work. God uses us to go out and do His work. Sure.
I think that's part of maturity. You know, we can be an immature Christian and say, I'm a believer and I belong to God, but I'm really not doing a whole lot for God in His kingdom. But as we grow, we begin to realize, hey, this is the thing. This is the thing, is to serve God's kingdom. This is all that matters. And I only have a certain number of years to do that. What else? Bearing fruit, absolutely. Okay. Share your faith. I can guarantee you'll grow in your faith if you share your faith. It'll rock your boat. And sometimes rock you to the core, but if you keep doing it, you'll grow in your faith. It's one of the sure ways of growing your faith is to share your faith with others. It challenges you. What is an example of the meat of New Testament Christian teaching? What is the teaching in the New Testament that you would consider to be meat? No? Learn more about the Word of God. That's a good general answer. Gee, I'm looking for something more specific, though. Faithfulness is one. Prayer? Oh, okay, I'll take that. We got people all over the map, prayer-wise. We got baby prayers, milk prayers, and we got some meat prayers. Thank you, that's a good one. Testimony, that's sharing again. You know, the thing that always comes to my mind when I get on this path, though, is the cross life. How much are we sacrificing for our faith? Now, it's typical of Western Christianity, I think, just in general, and I include myself, not even to think about that. Christianity in China, my goodness, Christianity in Iran and Iraq. For them, on a daily basis, Christianity is all about what? It's about sacrifice. Absolutely. And I think that's a teaching that in the West is meat. And if I'm right, then a lot of Western Christianity is surviving on milk at the present time. Number 7 on your outline. Wesley rejected Calvinism and predestination and promoted Arminianism and the need to pursue Christian perfection. Now, here's where I would disagree with Wesley at the end there, and I want to do this. I want to leave you with this idea. Please do not pursue Christian perfection. Did a preacher just say that? Yes, I did, and you can quote me on it. But quote the whole thing, okay? Not just half of it. Here's the rest of the quote. Don't pursue Christian perfection. Pursue Christian maturity. Okay? That's what the Bible calls on us to do. Be more like Jesus. If you pursue Christian perfection, you will drive yourself crazy, which I think John did in many ways. Because it's unattainable in this life. And he might argue with me about that. He had a lot of arguments about that. I'm way over time. There's so much more to say. But Marilyn's going to start throwing things at me any minute. So what happened in Methodists when they got to the United States. Oh, that's an interesting part of the story. God willing, we'll look at that next week. But don't pursue Christian perfectionism. Pursue Christian maturity. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for your spirit. We thank you for your